This is Laura London, and you're listening to Speaking of Jung. Joining us today for episode 73 is Jungian analyst and clinical psychologist Dr. Bradley TePaske in Los Angeles, California. He studied art history and received a Master of Fine Arts in printmaking from the University of Massachusetts before being called to train as a Jungian analyst at the C.G. Jung Institute Zürich, where he earned a diploma in analytical psychology. He then went on to study clinical psychology and received a Ph.D. from the Union Institute of Cincinnati. He also studied early Christianity and Greco-Roman mystery religions with Professor Birger A. Pearson at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Hindu Tantra with the Bengali scholar and art collector Ajit Mookerjee, and was a longtime student of the distinguished San Francisco Jungian psychiatrist Dr. Donald F. Sandner. For nearly 40 years, Dr. TePaske has practiced as a Jungian analyst and clinical psychologist and has served as an individual and group psychotherapist with the program in human sexuality at the University of Minnesota Medical School, the Parent Assistance Center in Santa Fe, Child Abuse Listening and Mediation in Santa Barbara, and the Violence Intervention Program, an inner-city domestic violence program in East Los Angeles. Dr. TePaske has lectured frequently at the C.G. Jung Institute of Los Angeles on the mythology and psychology of Gnosticism and myth, ritual, and initiation in the Greco-Roman mystery religions, and has presented numerous seminars on Mary Magdalene and the Sophia wisdom tradition to audiences in the United States, Europe, and Australia. His paper, The New Mary Magdalene, was a keynote lecture for the 50th anniversary of the C.G. Jung Institute Zürich in 1998. He is the author of Rape and Ritual, a Psychological Study, published by Inner City Books, and Sexuality and the Religious Imagination, previously published by Spring Journal Books and republished this year by Chiron. He is also a contributor to the books The Allure of Gnosticism, The Gnostic Experience in Jungian Psychology and Contemporary Culture, and The Sacred Heritage, The Influence of Shamanism on Analytical Psychology. Please visit the website speakingofjung.com, where you'll find links to everything discussed in this episode in the show notes. This interview is being recorded on Wednesday, September 16th, 2020, through the magic of Skype. Hi, Dr. TePaske.
Good morning. It's nice to be with you, and I'm honored to be included in your series with a number of people who are my colleagues and friends and people I respect.
So we're here today to take a look at your book that was just republished by Chiron. It's called Sexuality and the Religious Imagination. And when referring to it, I kept accidentally saying, and the religious instinct. So why is it titled Sexuality and the Religious Imagination?
That's a very interesting question, because instinct is something that goes on reflexively and quite naturally, and pertains, to the body's energies and the archetypes on one end of their spectrum. Jung talks about how the archetypal patterns in human beings descends into the body and into the red end of the spectrum, as he says, but it also has an image component, and it's a real central part of the book, Sexuality and the Religious Imagination, in that instinct is the basis, but it has this whole other component, psychical component, that really consists of images. Actually, I could quote the front piece from Sexuality and Religious Imagination that I used even when it first became my dissertation paper with the Union Institute in Cincinnati. It's a beautiful line that I had originally 26 years ago, and appears today in the same place in the publication. And it comes from a Gnostic poem that's really become quite famous called The Thunder, Perfect Mind. in which Eve, or Sophia as Eve, speaks of her nature. And and the passage goes, "For many are the pleasant forms that exist in numerous sins and incontinencies and disgraceful passions and fleeting pleasures, which men embrace until they become sober. And they will, and when then they will go up to me, and they will live, and they will not die again." Mm. That idea of those instinctual things, to start with your word, many are the pleasant forms that exist within them. You know? And the dreams are the most obvious example of that. So is just the fantasy that comes with falling asleep or being in a hypnagogic state or a hypnopompic state when you wake half awake or in half sleep in the morning. There's a lot of ways in which psyche and its imageries, as it were, gets into us.
So I'd like to get into the book in a little bit, but first I would like to talk a little bit about you and your background. You did your analytic training in Zurich. You then went on to receive a Ph.D., and a lot of the analysts I speak with do it sort of the other way around. They get their Ph.D. first, and then they do further training in Zurich. So would you tell us a little bit about how and why you did it that way?
It reminds me of being in Zurich when I was very young when I got there. I was 28, just turned 29. Oh, wow. My training. And believe me, I was reminded of how young I was. Number of people. And so there were a lot of people there who had come, like, after being ministers for years, or clinical psychologists for years, or in one case an entomologist for years, all different backgrounds. Mm-hmm. It's a wonderful part of that training program. And so I came after art school and after a very amazing and terrifying crisis that kind of gave me my depth psychological perspective very late at art school. So I went, after my MFA, I went immediately and worked in a psychiatric hospital in Minneapolis for a couple of years. And then I went on to Zurich. So when I got there, unlike many of the people around me, I was out to start a career, to study, to begin a career.
Okay.
And so as it turned out, in Minnesota, where I lived then, and given the arrangements between the original C.G. Jung Institute and the the Board of Education in Zurich, it was deemed a legal PhD equivalent.
Yes.
I could get my psychology license in Minnesota, and again, I had to redo a lot in California. So that says why I did that progression. Then I found myself in my early 30s, and I had time and could afford it. So I decided, why not get a full PhD instead of being Brad TePaske MFA forever.
Right.
And that's when I actually initiated the Rape and Ritual. Began as my diploma thesis in Zurich, and Sexuality and Religious Imagination was the product of my work with the Union Graduate Institute.
Would you tell us a little bit about Rape and Ritual? That was published by Daryl Sharp at Inner City Books. He did that frequently. He published the dissertations of his fellow trainees there in Zurich at the Institute. And it's gone out of print, but it is coming back in ebook format, and I will provide a link to that in the show notes. But it was published in 1982, I believe, originally. And as you mentioned to me earlier, it still holds today. So would you say a little bit about what is in that book?
Yeah, that was Daryl Sharp's fifth title, I believe. And I was honored that one of the persons who read it at Inner City was Marion Woodman, who I respect a great deal. I think that generated now when I was out of, personal issues, all the things trappings that go and contents that go along with a negative mother complex, or ostensibly negative, and experiences with my father and watching his life as a public servant from backstage generated that. When I was at that point to choose a topic in Zurich, my choices were the role of homoeros in the masculine psyche was one choice. The second one was the relationship of Jesus to women, because of course there's Mary Magdalene and there's a woman who drew water for him, the Samaritan woman, etc. So from those topics were things that were part of my work all along, especially the one about Mary Magdalene and Jesus really comes out a lot in Sexuality and the Religious Imagination. Mm-hmm. You know. While in Zurich, too, I also had that wonderful opportunity to hear lectures by Gilles Quispel, yes, who was a Dutchman, a very kind of fierce, professorial, proud guy. But I'm Dutch, my background is. And so he really gave me a window to look back on my Dutch Reformed, very Protestant Christian upbringing and really see it with a new Gnostic eye, mm-hmm, and come to appreciate it and kind of enter back into at least giving my Christian tradition the respect it deserved, mm-hmm, in the Gnostic key.
Well, I was going to ask you about him later, but let's talk a little bit about him now. I did watch his interview. There is that wonderful series, Remembering Jung, that was produced by the C.G. Jung Institute in Los Angeles, Suzanne, mm-hmm, Wagner and her husband, George Wagner. And one of those episodes, yes, is with Professor Quispel about the Jung Codex. Mm-hmm. A lot of our listeners are very interested in that. We don't really know the full story, just what Professor Quispel says in that video. What do you know about the Jung Codex? And I'd like to ask you about Jung's interest in Gnosticism.
I think we may come up a little bit short there. In general, I was always aware of the fact that Quispel knew the scholars who had opportunity to look at the Nag Hammadi finds from 1945, and knew that there was need of funding, the attention to them, the prep, the care of the manuscripts, their translations and such. And so he was privy to opportunities to get the Jung Codex and name it such, mm-hmm, and give it to C.G. Jung. I believe it was actually something that was given to the C.G. Jung Institute. And my primarily getting involved in Gnosticism was largely based on the publication of the Nag Hammadi library as a whole, mm-hmm, rather than the Jung Codex, which I don't know much of anything about. Except that was something that Jung was certainly ready to take a look at. I've often thought that C.G. Jung would have just joyed in a full copy of the Nag Hammadi library, yes, because he didn't have a chance to get into that. I'm sure he would have devoured it with love and vigor.
So what was your experience with those texts?
There's a number of things. The Gnostics talk about imagery in a very, very wonderful way, mm-hmm, in a highly psychological way. Actually, I just wrote to a friend last night and thought of one of them. This gives you a sense of that. It was, let's see, the quote is, "When you see your face, you smile. But when you see those images which came into being before you did, and which can neither be made manifest nor forgotten, then how much will you have to bear?" Mm-hmm. There's another one quite similar in spirit to that, which actually is in the flap of the dust jacket of this book, where Jesus says in the Gospel of Thomas, I believe it is, yes, at the beginning, "Let him who seeks continue seeking until he finds. And when he finds, he will become troubled. And when he becomes troubled, he will become astonished. That's a hint, too, at how the things that you meet in a crisis, in the darkness of unknowing, in your suffering, that comes through. And it's a very beautiful, concise saying of that. When naive family members or acquaintances say the typical thing you say to psychologists, many people or psychotherapists here is, how can you stand to just sit there and listen to everybody's problems day in and day out? I always chuckle a little bit and use that line. It's cryptic and teasing to keep on seeking until you find. And when you become troubled, you will become astonished. It also adds, and rule over the all. That means you'll get it. You'll know there's an inner world. You'll have a hint of the autonomy and numinous life of the collective unconscious. Gnosticism is really a very profound, highly spiritualized or Platonized archetypal psychology, from the first century. And it's been made an immense impact on our era, what it has said to to banish the sexist slander of Mary of Magdalene, Jesus' intimate companion over the years, and to bring her into her real light as the disciple, or the disciple who Jesus loved the most, and who he used to kiss often on the mouth. And also, perhaps more importantly, bringing Mary Magdalene into full glory as an amazing visionary, as you find in the Gnostic Gospel of Mary.
So these Gospels that you're referring to are from the Nag Hammadi Library, the find from 1945. And
yeah, the Gospel of Mary is the one I just referred, but there's an array of wonderful things. One thing I might add, too, comes from one of the documents in that collection called the Apocryphon of John, where there's a wonderful description of how the Adam, with Eve inside him, of course, was fashioned from clay and laid there for a long time. But then a mixture of angels and demons came and fashioned a psychic body for that clay thing, and it came to life. And it's almost tantric-like in its suggestion of the chakra symbols that many schools in this big complex called Hinduism have elaborated over the years. So very interesting connection there. Also is that some of the earliest Christian communities in east from Israel, what's now Israel, there were Buddhist communities who had kind of not monasteries, but groups that may have been touched the Nag Hammadi tradition a bit. Quispel talks about that more articulately, of course.
And so how did you come to read these Gospels? What drew you to them? How did you find out about them? And what I want to get to is their connection with Jungian psychology.
Oh, right. No, I read Memories, Dreams, Reflections, and I this word Gnosticism.
Right.
In German, or more properly, someone does say Gnosis.
I see.
And the very professorial Gilles Quispel, with his lecturing reading glasses on, there's nobody who could say Gnosis
right.
like him as he pushed his glasses back up to the bridge of his nose.
Yes.
But I thought, well, what on earth is this G word? I thought there was a wonderful audacity in having a word that started with GN. It was just kind of, and then I started reading some of it. Actually, on the way to Zurich, mother, my children, my former wife Norma, we were be going to over New England, I guess it was, on our way to Europe for me to start training at the Jung Institute. And there was a huge conference on Gnosticism at Yale. And I begged her, let's go to that. Let's go to that.
Yeah.
She said, yeah, that might be nice, but I think we've really got enough on our plate to just be flying off to Zurich to start Jungian training. So I missed it.
You missed it. So your essay, Mary Magdalene in the Canonical and Gnostic Gospels, is included in a book called The Allure of Gnosticism, The Gnostic Experience in Jungian Psychology and Contemporary Culture. It includes essays by Murray Stein, June Singer, Professor Quispel, Elaine Pagels. And I'm wondering if you would explain to us a little bit about how Mary Magdalene fits into analytical psychology, because you say something about how, I'm looking for it here, you talk about her erotic bond to Jesus and how, something about how she confronts the unconscious. She dares to confront the unconscious, yes.
Yeah, I was quite amazed and grateful to Murray Stein when he asked me to write a paper for that book, because the people you've just mentioned were a little older than me and of very significant standing. So it was like a big deal for me to get in that book. But I think when we talk about Mary Magdalene and Jesus bond, I mean, we have to think of eros in its full spectrum, from bodily affection or whatever one wants to understand that, into eros in the real sense of a penetrating desire to know. And Hillman says somewhere, wherever eros is pointing, something psychological is happening. But the most, in the Gospel of Mary, the thing that's quite wonderful, is it the Gospel of Mary? Yes, it is. Where Peter and the other disciples, Peter gets up and says to the disciples, basically, hey guys, Mary has been talking to Jesus alone, and she's had a vision of him that she knows about, but we do not. And it's an interesting context. Here's all the guys and Mary Magdalene. So the misogynist question is right there. But anyhow, she stands up before them and says, I saw the Master in a vision today. And he smiled at me and blessed me. This is right after the crucifixion. He has this vision of Jesus appearing in a visionary state in spirit and blessing her for not flinching at the sight of him. She stands strong and erect and can deal with this powerful visionary appearance of him. I mean, it really goes along with the ambiance of losing the most beloved person, you could possibly lose, and has that ambiance that breaks through of all kinds of little mysterious synchronicities and curiosity about the membrane between this side of life and the other that are part of that ambiance. But Mary is bold to stand there and meet her Lord. That says it.
Yes. So how do you deal with, we're here in the United States, this is largely a Christian culture. And this idea...
Nominally, yes.
Yes. And this idea that Jesus had a relationship of that kind with Mary Magdalene, and there's proof of it, there isn't proof of it. How do you deal with, sort of integrating that into what the times we're living in, the culture we're living in? What do you say to that?
I think of people like Elaine Pagels or Karen King or or Nancy Qualls, women who have really worked on that. Rosamund Miller was a Gnostic hierophant. I really would use that word for her in Palo Alto. She actually married my wife Arlene and I.
Did she? Oh, nice.
Yeah, that was quite nice. It was a very Sophianic wedding.
Oh, wow.
I'll let the women who've worked on that speak for themselves in their own way. But for me, originally, I was going to my book, Sexuality and the Religious Imagination. It had been my dissertation, and then I wanted to write a book on Mary Magdalene. And I made a couple different pilgrimages to Magdalene sites in the south of France that were really important. I happened, speaking of the ambiance of losing someone who meant as much to you as anyone could, the night before I flew off to Paris to then take the TGV down to the Magdalene sites near Marseille, I found from a friend who left a message on my machine that Don Sandner had just died of a heart.
I know he was very important to you.
So I kind of dragged my innards around Paris for a few nights, drank too much, and all the rest of it in just this grief. But the rest of it then got luminous, and the whole trip down there and to the famous cave at Nant-les-Pins in southern France. It's about 50 miles north of Marseille. That's what, the great artists have always shown Magdalene in her cave entrance. And I went to the real place where she, it's myth and legend, truth and poetry in that part of the world. But I actually visited the cave that Mary Magdalene supposedly dwelled in, and I definitely lit a few candles and burned a little incense in memory of my dear friend Don Sandner.
Would you tell us a little bit about him? You dedicate your book to him, and he was your mentor and your teacher. And would you tell us a little bit about his influence on you?
Yeah, when I got home after Zurich to Minneapolis and was back with the Minnesota Jung Association, the people, I had a list of 3 people who I was assigned to invite to Twin Cities to speak, because I was the program chair. One of them was John Talley from Santa Fe, whose house I later purchased when I moved there for a while.
Oh, did you?
The other was Marion Woodman, and which was a great honor. And the other was this guy named Donald Sandner from San Francisco. And I remember he got off the plane and he walked off and our eyes met and we just grinned at each other. And by the end of the weekend, in which he talked about his wonderful work on Navajo symbols of healing, we had become real friends. And when he went back to San Francisco, he sent me a crystal that he claimed, with sufficient whimsy, was a fossilized shaman's bone.
Oh.
And I happened to have a newly cast skin of a California king snake, which was a pet of mine, that I rolled up and sent back to him. So with the shaman's crystal and the snake skin, we forged a partnership and a real love for each other that only ripened over many, many years. Actually, I have in my home altar here, I have a little box with skulls all over it. And in it is that snake skin that I got back from Don's desk, as well as a tiny little dried up salamander with my little white and blue bead baby bracelet that says TePaske on it. So that's my inner sanctum here in my office.
And so what do these things mean to you? They're obviously numinous to you. And what can you tell us about the importance of objects such as those? Oh,
yeah. Would you remind me of that after I say one more thing about Don?
Sure, yeah.
I have actually in a file on my computer. It says, if I to call, in italics, myself a shaman, which I don't, because it's too much of an indigenous thing. Mm-hmm. The thing about Sandner was that he was a real friend of the Navajo, that he worked with a healer named Natani So for, I think, 9 summers, a month each for 9 summers. And as back as the early 60s, he and a companion went down into Peru, over the Andes, and into a shaman community where they had, the original indigenously rooted experiences that were a part of his life and that he, shared with me. What's your question?
My question was about the objects that you collected, how they're numinous and meaningful and symbolic, and I was just wondering if you would, because I too have little altars all over my house, and if you would just say a few words about their meaning for you, for us. Well,
I call them like the household god, just little household gods, mm-hmm. Just things that, like, there's a polished little piece of marble there that C.A. Meyer gave me. Uh-huh. Analyst in Zurich. I said, it'd be nice to have something like an object from you. So he just handed me this polished piece of marble he'd found along the Mediterranean somewhere. Little things like that. But Hillman talks about that in one of his lectures too, in a nice way, about how people's homes end up being filled with little household gods. Mm-hmm. They just have the right memory. They capture a moment. Without even get too mystical about them. Those are just I think we're like bowerbirds do that too. Gather all kinds of shiny objects for reasons they may not cogitate about, mm-hmm. but they do it. And so human beings just have many really tokens like that. I just call them the little household gods.
I love that. Yeah. So Dr. Sandner edited a book called The Sacred Heritage, The Influence of Shamanism on Analytical Psychology, and it contains your essay on Eliade, Jung, and Shamanism. Mm-hmm. So in that, you show sort of the ways that shamanism is very similar to Jung's archetypal psychology, and that in many ways, archetypal psychology is a modern offshoot of ancient shamanism.
Let's see how to put that. I think that our Jung's psychology, archetypal psychology, also the work of Mircea Eliade, who's an amazing, towering figure in religious studies. Mm-hmm. Mircea Eliade was at the University of Chicago, Romanian religious history, and his book, Shamanism, Archaic Techniques of Ecstasy. They're both archetypal psychologies in a way. That's the stuff of it that really bring us into an understanding of shamanism. One of the most important ways, I think, in which Jung kind of places a shamanic initiation is in his essay on I think it's in Transformation in the Catholic Mass, where he talks about the sacrifice and the torturing sacrifice that Jesus underwent in one level, or concretely. Then he talks about the visions of a certain Greek alchemist named Zosimos, where there's a psychical figure, a figure in a dream, a kind of magical little midget, or Antiparion, as he calls him, mm-hmm. who tears himself apart, swallows himself down, spits himself out, and takes his original shape. Sort of like Proteus. It's a real dynamic process in that little vision of Zosimos. And then on an archaic level, where we return to shamanism, Jung talks about the rituals of shamanic dismemberment, where the shaman's body will be experienced in trance state, as being rent apart or split open, having all of his bones set outside himself and numbered and replaced. And then, interestingly enough, having all of his internal viscera replaced with crystals.
Mm.
I mean, that's the glorified body of Christ on an archetypal level. You know, that's seeing the flesh and the interior of flesh and finding these real kernels of perpetual spirit wrapped within that. I'm not sure where people are going with shamanism today, because in Los Angeles is crawling with shamans. And at least people who take ayahuasca and go to, or the fashion now is to microdose with some psilocybin mushrooms. So I look upon that as just all these, in an LA key, of course, which is usually over the top and me-centered. But as many people engaged in this, seeking of the religious experience in lots of ways, because as Jung talked a lot about, the belief in collective, large, integrative religious systems has really broken down into a point where we're all in search. Some people have argued or discussed this to death, in search of our own myth. And so in spite of my own weird experiments and excesses on these fronts over the years, when I look out in my clientele too, about people who are into shamanism and doing all these experiences, it's an ongoing cultural experiment on an individual level, and it's just what people are doing. My comment is completely secondary to any of it.
Mm. So let's talk about the theme of your book, Sexuality and the Religious Imagination. What are you trying to say here as far as the similarities between sex and religion?
Well, it's interesting. We was talking about ritual a little bit. Mm-hmm. And isn't it interesting that people's sexual behaviors tend toward having a kind of ritualized format? Mm-hmm. This is how we do it. Let's light some candles. Let's have some glass of wine. Let's do this. Let's wear that, et cetera, et cetera. And just like religious ritual does. There's an old thing about a discussion about how when young people at like 13 or 14 can come into a time of tremendous religious fervor, that somehow I've heard people mechanistically talk about that as kind of a defense against all the energies of budding sexuality. But I would dispense with the dualism and say that it's peace. It's of a piece, the two things working together.
This book is filled with lots of different religious takes. You talk about the patriarchy, medieval sexual heresies, the body, dreams, of course. And sorry, I just knocked something over. How fitting. And Hindu tantra, and of course Gnosticism.
I worked on it for 24 years.
Yeah, my goodness. And are there any differences between, I was talking to Steve Buser about this, who just is the publisher at Chiron.
I'm really grateful to him for taking me on. Yeah.
So the book had gone out of print, I think, because it was originally published by Spring, and then they closed their doors. And to keep this book in circulation, Chiron republished it just this year. And I was wondering if there were any additions or any changes to the new version.
No, it's the same text. Yeah.
Okay.
But there's one thing you mentioned. I happen to have reread the chapter on medieval sexual heresies. Getting off on that tangent, I had been interested in tantra, which is, of course, the most florid celebration of spiritual, sexual, and spirit. I remember Edward Whitman, who was really influential on me early on, talked about sexual religious ritual. That's the first time I really kind of heard that notion. Mm-hmm. And I had Ajit, who's collected tantric arts. So I wondered, and it's one of the germinal questions of the book I wrote, is that if there are these things that pop up like in Hindu Tantra, then what other sorts of things in other different contexts have approximated, a sacramental or quasi-sacramental approach to sexuality? And for some reason, I read a book called, a fantastic classic book called The Pursuit of the Millennium by Norman Cohn, Cohn, where he talks about millennialist groups later in Christian tradition, long after the Sibylline prophecies and all that, in the 12th, 13th, 14th centuries, and where there was all kinds of different kinds of groups that sprang up, sort of non-official orders of the Catholic Church, some more heretical, some very libertine, some very dark. It led forward in time to, some of the witch craze stuff, and anticipated the far off at that point, Reformation. And that was in an era, too, when the cult of the Virgin sprang up in the 12th century and was really part of the whole context. So that's how I ended up getting into that particular chapter. But, rereading it just yesterday, and then I came to, it's very, very pertinent, one thing in that book, pertinent to today, because I have just the vaguest idea of what QAnon is in the political jargon and conspiracy theories of the day. But I found a context for it. Well, first I heard about it. There's a context for it that I call in that book the archetypal orgy with certain features. It goes all the way back to the Romans thinking that Christians were actual cannibals and did terrible things with children and child abuse. Fast forward, it came up again in the Middle Ages, where, of course, Jews were scapegoated in Europe, and it was Christians who said that it was Jews who in secret underground meetings at night would pray to the devil or kiss his parts and eat children or make cakes out of their flesh, and that it just knocked me back, because then I heard about this strange thing about clandestine child trafficking networks and stuff that are being projected on very reasonable people, like Hillary Clinton, for instance, in this time. And it's, for anyone listening, that's a very interesting strand of a repetitious pattern of incredible inflation mixed with deadly projection onto a minority group, and is really current today. So I'm glad that I reread my chapter of my own book in preparation. I'll talk to you.
Well, so why do you see this happening? It's a repetition. It's happened before in history. So what's the hook there, and what purpose is it serving here today?
Well, we have a figure in the country who's risen to the level of the God man, who resembles more Yeats' Desert Beast with the body of a man and the head of a lion in his poem, The Second Coming. I think the forces that are spreading the QAnon rumor in an attempt to smear more progressive persons is part of that same old mythologum, or that same old cultural theme. And it's just as virulent as it has been in the past.
So what's happening in these individuals who are doing this projecting who are smearing the group, really, individuals and group. I'd like to further understand what is happening psychologically, because I'm not hearing much of that.
But the sociological context of this, the book I mentioned, The Pursuit of the Millennium by Norman Kahn, the church was breaking down, its spiritual and political authority was being degraded. There was an accumulation of poor, displaced proletarian populations, in city centers up and down the Rhine, frustrated, hungry, scratching for food, displaced from the land, feudal systems history. And they were the ones who were particularly heir to the arising, because groups always form a monofigure around an ideal one, and they always find a scapegoat. That's a classic split, And so they were highly susceptible to having someone come along and prop themselves up as a certain God man whose prerogatives are sundry and polymorphous, and who has power and sets himself as a savior for a confused, scrambling underclass.
So what's the antidote? How do we remedy this?
It's too big for a facile comment. One might read about Wotan in Jung's essay after the catastrophe of Nazism.
Yes, we covered that in the episode with Thomas Lavin back in 2016.
Great source. Tom Lavin is marvelous. And a modest man. Yeah.
I'd like to have you talk about the devil, the Christian shadow, the feminine, the hatred of the feminine.
Yeah, that's an old one. I think that I've thought about it in a different, not so archetype, that I think that I've always been amazed at the mistreatment of women in the world, the negativity, the frequency of spousal abuse. I worked in the DV clinic, and I think that for the men who are their perpetrators, some of the darkness that their minds are clouded with really has to do with the whole precedence of the mother and the feminine over the process of birth. A fetus goes through a tremendous Stan Groff writes about this magnificently. Like all of us, men go through the birth process that goes from being in an immovable situation under high pressure through a really stimulating sexually and with regards to anger and ragefulness, those energies, in a passage steadily to finally being born. And I think the deep psychosomatic memory of that, in men particularly, is one of the things that's hiding way down in the depths behind the horrible stories of rape or femicide, that we encounter today. And of course, just your run-of-the-mill domestic violence and the diminution of women.
So that would need to be brought to the surface then, if that's really hidden way down underneath.
Yeah, of course. I'm talking so broadly here. I work with one person at a time.
Right.
Myself, the hardest of all, in great privacy. The privacy of a psychotherapy session. I like to think of myself as a guardian of privacy, a guardian of ultimate privacy in an invasive world, And so for that's the question of facing one's fear, accepting the inevitability of suffering, recognizing that done right, suffering is the teacher of compassion, the Buddhist theme, and that there's a way to keep our humanity, nice word, German word, our Menschlichkeit alive, even through these incredible struggles. It goes back to that line I used earlier about, if you're seeking, when you find you'll become troubled, and when troubled and do it right, you can be astonished.
Yes. And I appreciate you bringing that up, because this podcast gets a little difficult sometimes. These conversations get difficult because speaking to a broad general audience is not something that Jungian analysts are used to doing.
I'm quite aware. Yeah.
Yes, and that the work is done one-on-one. And that is why I am not promoting this podcast as being something that can take the place of analysis. I like to promote and encourage people to enter into Jungian analysis and not use groups or books as any kind of substitute. And it is quite awkward and difficult sometimes where I use social media to promote the podcast, and it's not easy and it's not well understood. So these episodes are more of kind of an introduction to this work, and they are with Jungian analysts because I truly believe that the work is done on ourselves, on our individual selves, and can't be done just by reading books. It must be done through the analytic relationship, I believe. So I appreciate you bringing that up.
Well, and appreciate the context that you just laid. I think with the solitude that's imposed upon us by the coronavirus too, one of the things I hope as a psychotherapist, analyst, depth psychologist, whatever, is that people will, in their solitude, in their isolation, will find some redeeming insight, that will carry them through, and that's the sheltering in place has many possibilities, and depth psychological insight is one of them.
Yes, indeed. So we're coming up on an hour, and I was wondering if there was anything else you would like to discuss before we wrap up.
I think that I've sort of been giving you a general impression of many of the themes in the book, and I appreciate this opportunity. It is something that is challenging, and when all is said and done, too, about this word religion, I'm not so much interested in any particular religion, but I am very, very fascinated by the individual's religious experience, which is a natural function in the human organism. The religions can take care of themselves, we hope.
And the interesting thing about the book is that you tie that in with sexuality. And that I see that maybe as being something that is not going to be well understood and maybe not well received.
Well, there's one idea that might clarify that. Patriarchy, I talk a lot about patriarchy, has always looked upon, and Christian or Catholic and Christian has always looked upon, sexuality as for the purpose of procreation. And that procreation or reproductions can also be looked at in the inverse as a mere footnote to sexuality. Because sexuality, as we know since Freud, and as we know in the amount of how many sexual acts take place on the planet every day without the faintest intention of reproduction, and how intimate a part of interpersonal relationships, marriages, and love affairs it is. So that's a good point to echo what you've brought up. Well, I hope this has been accessible and interesting to people, and that it's of some value, but nothing replaces one's work on one's own heart and one's own psyche, and the insights that can come right in your own life, whether great or small, by public opinion.
Very well said. Thank you, Dr. TePaske.
Okay, it's been my pleasure.
Please visit the website Speaking of Jung, that's JUNG.com, for more information on everything that was discussed in this episode. There you will also find all of the previous episodes of this podcast, which are available to stream or to download for free. This podcast is also available on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Play, TuneIn, Spotify, and iHeartRadio. And it will be available later in the week on our YouTube channel, Jungian Laura. You can also listen to this episode on your Amazon Echo device, simply by saying, "Alexa, play Speaking of Jung on Apple Podcasts," or TuneIn. Just be sure to pronounce Jung with a hard J. So with special thanks to Chiron Publications, this is Laura London, and you've been listening to Speaking of Jung.